Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 31. The Uncrowned King. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin today, I'd like to thank our new member of the House of Lords, Carlo Viscount Eber. If you want to join him, go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica. All patrons get ad-free versions of my podcasts, and Earls and above get access to bonus content like the history of the Mughal Empire. Last week, we saw the rise and fall of the Nominated Assembly, better known as Barebone's Parliament. Born in the aftermath of Oliver Cromwell's dissolution of the Rump Parliament, it was intended as a temporary placeholder, an assembly of competent and driven men who would put the Republic back on firmer footing, make the reforms which needed to be made, and then arrange for the return of a representative parliamentary government. As we saw, it didn't go quite like that. It was one thing to agree that some things were broken and some things needed to change, but agreeing on what was broken, what needed to change, and what that change would look like was a very different thing. Barebone's Parliament was given 16 months to do its work, but it only took 5 before moderate and conservative figures in the Assembly lost patience with radicals who wanted to do too much too fast. Collaborating with key figures in the army, but probably not Cromwell himself, the moderates sabotaged Barebone's Parliament, declaring their own dissolution and returning all power back to Cromwell. We left off last week with John Lambert, army officer and, now, constitutional theorist, bringing his general a solution: the instrument of government. At the heart of the instrument, the first written constitution in English history, was power sharing. It created a single person, the Lord Protector, as the executive, a Council of State to advise him, and an elected Parliament. The first Lord Protector was, obviously, intended to be Cromwell, and the instrument of government bestowed on this office the trappings of monarchy. The Lord Protector ruled for life. He, because of course it was a he, would have control over the army and the navy. Writs, laws, and patents would be issued in his name. Diplomacy and foreign affairs, including war and peace, would be his responsibility. The Lord Protector would be head of state. He would summon, open, and close parliaments, and he would govern the nation with the aid of his council. Now, all of this sounds a lot like a king, doesn't it? The similarities between the Lord Protector and a constitutionally constrained king aren't coincidences. Lambert's instrument of government was standing on the shoulders of previous proposed settlements, the heads of proposals, and the officers' agreement of the people chief amongst them. It wasn't that long ago that the army was prepared to put Charles I back on the throne if he'd only accept some constraints on his power. It was only after he'd refused to do so, and then further tarnished the office of king in the army's eyes through his duplicity, that they saw it as God's providence to dispense with monarchy entirely. In the early drafts of the instrument of government, the new executive position intended for Cromwell was that of King Oliver I. It was only after Cromwell refused to hear of it that Lord Protector became the workaround. But one thing that both the original and the final draft of the instrument enshrined were checks on the executive's power. For starters, the Lord Protector was responsible to a Council of State, and he was meant to govern with their agreement and consent, and he couldn't simply dismiss them like a king could. The first members of this council were named in the instrument of government, and in the fullness of time it was this body which would elect his successor as Lord Protector. The election would be by majority vote, and they could pick anyone as long as they were not from the Stuart dynasty. The council was in charge of the day-to-day running of the country, responsible for law, tax, trade, and intelligence gathering, and for this each councillor was paid £1,000 a year. Cromwell was, indisputably, the most important figure on it, But the council would not merely rubber stamp his decisions. The third party to this government was Parliament, and in a lot of ways it looks like any other parliament we've seen over the years, but with lessons learned from the revolutions. Parliaments were to be triennial, and they could not be dissolved within 5 months of their first sitting without their consent. This straddled the middle ground between a parliament wholly at the whims of the sovereign and a sovereign who couldn't get anything done if Parliament refused to work with him. MPs would be elected with an expanded electorate, with any man worth at least £200 being given the right to vote. We're a long way from the Putney debates, aren't we? Besides the property qualification, they also couldn't be Catholic, have taken part in the Irish Rebellion, or have fought against Parliament in the wars. But this was still a much, much larger franchise than previously. Parliament also had to approve any appointments for high officers of state, and had to agree to the disposition of the military while they sat. If they weren't in session, and war was declared, they had to be recalled, or a new parliament summoned. There was only one chamber. This was a unicameral parliament without a House of Lords, and any laws they passed needed the Lord Protector's approval, unless 20 days passed, in which case another majority vote would make it law. And of course, no taxes could be levied without Parliament's consent. Just as the role of the sovereign was limited under the instrument, so too were parliaments. Overmighty parliaments had been almost as corrupt, tyrannical, and unrepresentative as the Stuart monarchy, according to Lambert and the army. It was one of the reasons for the role of Lord Protector, to separate the executive from the legislature. The Rump, and then Barebone's Parliament, had acted as both. Until Parliament met, and when Parliament wasn't in session, the Protector and the Council of State could make laws, although they'd need to be ratified by Parliament when it next met. Parliament had to be called triennially every 3 years, and they couldn't be dissolved before they'd sat for 5 months, and this was a marked improvement on previous royal governments. But that meant that if the Protector and the Council so wished, Parliament would only sit for 5 months every 3 years, leaving the other 31 months for them to govern without it. This protectoral personal rule wasn't intended by the instrument, but it did allow for it. Also, the protectoral veto was suspensive. The Protector could only delay legislation. He couldn't deny it like a king could by refusing royal assent. But the suspensive nature of the veto didn't apply to certain laws. The Protector could reject laws which affected religious liberty, the maintenance of the military, and the frequency, life, and powers of parliaments. These were set in stone by the instrument of government, and Parliament was not allowed to change them. But as we'll see, they will still try. Besides these administrative elements of the instrument, Cromwell and Lambert's beloved freedom of conscience was enshrined in the Constitution. Christianity was the official state religion and would be supported by the state, but there was no restriction on what kind of Christianity the people of the Commonwealth were permitted to worship, except for, quote, popery or prelacy, or those who, quote, under the profession of Christ, hold forth and practice licentiousness. Catholicism, what we might call Anglicanism, and presumably ranters. Now, this was not a black and white ruling. The Protectorate was far more concerned with the infrastructure of Catholicism and Anglicanism, Cromwell's infamous hatred of Catholic clergy, for example, than ordinary believers, provided those believers didn't prioritise their loyalty to the Pope or to the Stuarts, in other words, commit sedition or treason, or support the return of bishops, then the Protectorate mostly left them alone to worship as they wished. Austin Woolrich describes Cromwell as offering, quote, quiet protection of practising Roman Catholics from serious persecution, though not from fines for recusancy, and the blind eye that he turned to much Anglican worship, except when serious royalist conspiracies were discovered, end quote. He would also develop a close friendship with George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, and famously, the Lord Protector would encourage the return of Jews to England, centuries after they'd been expelled, although there is more to that story, as we'll cover in a future episode. Though the office of Lord Protector was, in many ways, more limited than that of a Stuart king, it also had strengths which Charles I could have only dreamt of. For one thing, the Lord Protector was guaranteed a yearly revenue, drawn from customs duties, of £200,000, plus the money necessary to recruit, equip and field a standing army of 30,000 men, 20,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The instrument also provided for a navy made up of, quote, a convenient number of ships for guarding of the seas, end quote. Now, of course, £200,000 was far too small for the royal household before the war. The king would have considered that poverty, the poor dear. But what Charles would have done for a standing army? Of course, the army was currently more than twice as large as 30,000, but it was needed. There was a war with the Dutch. Ireland had only recently been conquered. There was a rebellion in Scotland. And there was always the fear of foreign intervention to restore the Stuarts. As the decade carried on, though, these threats and fears would dissipate, and the army would slowly be reduced in size. The instrument of government ensured that the priorities of the army, religious toleration and its own pay, were secured. The instrument also confirmed all articles of surrender made between the army and its opponents. Since the Long Parliament, the Rump Parliament and Barebone's Parliament had all picked at these threads, Lambert wanted it all tied up in a bow, and the army's honour preserved. With the instrument of government, balance had hopefully been struck between an executive or a legislature having too much power. On the 16th of December 1653, the new Council of State gathered in their first formal meeting under the instrument of government. They didn't meet for long, and in fact only made one decision: to publish the proclamation of a new government, that Cromwell had been declared Lord Protector and that he had accepted the position. The proclamation was printed in broadsheets and sent out across the country. Cromwell was not present at this first council because he was getting ready for the day's main event. Later that day, London saw a coronation, and unlike the last one which Londoners had witnessed, there was very little fanfare. The route between Whitehall and Westminster was lined with soldiers, but the crowds they were watching were small. It wasn't publicised ahead of time, and very few people had even known that it was taking place at all. Even foreign dignitaries, like the Venetian and French ambassadors, had no idea it was happening, and had to borrow the details of the event from the newspapers for their reports home. Only people who were going about their ordinary business around Whitehall and Westminster saw anything, and they wouldn't have known what they were seeing. A procession of carriages and mounted lifeguards rode from Whitehall to the Palace of Westminster. The man of the hour was dressed in a plain black suit and cloak. It's almost always described as Puritan black. And he wasn't wearing any formal robes of state. He was also not wearing his uniform, which was a deliberate decision to de-emphasize that his legitimacy, his new office, this new government itself, came from his military power. The ceremony itself took place in Westminster Hall. The Lord Protector strode in, with the sword of state carried behind him by John Lambert, the architect of this new regime. Also in attendance was the Lord Mayor of London, the Lord Commissioners of the Great Seal of England, judges, aldermen, the members of the new Council of State, and the leading officers of the army. Then the instrument of government was read aloud, and it took half an hour to read. When it was finished, Viscount Lisle read the inauguration oath to Cromwell, as spelled out in the instrument of government, to seek the peace, quiet, and welfare of England, Ireland, and Scotland, to ensure law and justice was equally administered, and to govern the nations according to law and custom. Cromwell swore to do so. He then gave a short speech, and was then invited to sit in what can only be described as a throne. He was then handed the sword of state, and the seals and purse of his office. The Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, of England, Ireland, and Scotland, was then acclaimed by the hall. Soldiers outside fired gun salutes, and the inauguration, or perhaps coronation, was done. The group then rode back to Whitehall, and by this point word had got around that something was happening. Crowds now gathered, and as the procession rode by, some people cheered. They were drowned out by the deafening salutes of warships anchored in the Thames and from the guns of the Tower of London. The Lord Protector and his entourage gathered in the banqueting hall to hear a sermon by the Puritan preacher Thomas Goodwin. It was a situation ripe with symbolism. This was the room in which Charles I had spent his final moments before the scaffold. The ceiling above them was decorated with the apotheosis of James I, a painted celebration of absolutist divine right monarchy. The men who had torn down that ideology could now look up at it as the elite in this new order. Goodwin spoke of the Israelites journeying through the wilderness before they found the Promised Land. The English were the Israelites. Perhaps the Promised Land was now in reach. The man at the centre of it all was not quite a king, and he now led a government which was not quite a monarchy. The supporters of this new regime hoped that they had found the middle way, democracy and liberty balanced by the steady hand of a chief magistrate, whose own hands were tied. The best of monarchy mixed with the best of the republic. The new regime's critics thought otherwise. It didn't take long for those critics to make their thoughts known, especially from the ranks of the religious radicals. Christopher Feake, the fifth monarchist preacher who had met with Cromwell in November after attacking him from the pulpit, kept to his idiom. He was joined by the Anabaptist Vavasseur Powell, and they both denounced Cromwell and the new instrument of government 2 days after its inauguration. Though Cromwell had been patient with Feake a few weeks ago, his patience had run dry. Such blatant attacks on the new regime, before it even had its feet under the table, would not be tolerated. Both men were arrested and, briefly, imprisoned. Other malcontents were closer to home. They were certainly closer to Cromwell. This included people who would soon come to be known as Commonwealth men, Republicans who had either led the charge towards a kingless government or who placed the sovereignty of Parliament above all else. This included John Bradshaw, the resolute servant of the Republic who'd called out Cromwell to his face, Sir Henry Vane and Sir Arthur Haselrig, veterans of the Long Parliament and the Rump, Edmund Ludlow, who was one of the few military figures who refused to follow Cromwell down this path. These men, and many besides, saw the dissolution of the Rump, the self-destruction of the nominated assembly, and then the declaration of the Protectorate as betrayal after betrayal of what the civil wars and the revolutions had been for. Was it all really just to see Oliver Cromwell as a king in all but name? They didn't think so. But for now, these critics were sidelined. With Cromwell inaugurated, it was time to get to work. The first Protectorate Parliament was scheduled for September 1654, after it was pushed back from February. In the meantime, as per the instrument of government, the Lord Protector and his council could issue ordinances which had the force of law. From December until Parliament met, the council would consider almost 200 acts and pass more than 80 of them. Most of these were ordinary, meant to keep the functions of government running smoothly. These included, of course, the state's revenue. Customs duties, the excise taxes, the monthly assessment, and other forms of fundraising were renewed. An ordinance was quickly published to allow the title and authority of the Lord Protector to be used in court and in legal documents. But many of these ordinances were far from ordinary. What Coward calls a longer-term programme aimed at settlement and reformation, a programme which it did not believe Parliament could be trusted to carry out." End quote. Cromwell and the council were well aware that their regime was lacking support, especially from moderate and conservative opinion, which had been, generally speaking, horrified by the instability of 1653. 3 governments in a year? Madness! This wasn't 2022. The Protectorate attempted to present itself as a traditional, stable government. That first meeting of the council, on the day of the inauguration, had been the first step of this. Their proclamation was to be read out by the sheriffs, and the use of words like His Highness and Commonwealth were very familiar, Sheriffs had read out proclamations from highnesses about the Commonwealth all the time before the wars. Maybe this wasn't such a radical change after all. In January, an ordinance repealed the 1650 Act, which required all adult males to swear an oath acknowledging the abolition of monarchy and the House of Lords. Though obviously worrying Republicans, as it only played into their fears of Cromwell's intentions, this was seen by Conservatives as a good step. They were soon followed by other steps, regal-sounding steps. In February, the Protector made an official visit to the City of London, where he knighted the Lord Mayor. In April, the royal palaces were given to the Protector for his personal use, and Cromwell moved his whole family into Whitehall Palace. This did not look good from a Republican's perspective, but again, it wasn't intended for them. It was meant to win over Conservatives who were pleased to see signs that, though obviously unprecedented and born from revolution, the Protectorate was not turning the world upside down. The social order was not going to be challenged, even as some reforms were made. The council set up a committee to, finally, reform the Court of Chancery. But the leading figures placed on the committee dragged their feet, at least partly because all three of them had vested interests in how Chancery already operated. One was the Attorney General, the second was a Chancery Commissioner, and the third was a lawyer who practiced in the Court of Chancery. After spring turned to summer, and there was still very little progress, Cromwell met with the committee, and he brought a friend. The religious independent and legal reformer, William Shepherd. 2 months later, the Chancery Ordinance was approved by the Protector. The reforms took aim at the court's corruption and delays. It empowered justices of the peace to take depositions, instead of expecting litigants to travel to the court in London. It also made the court sit in the afternoon, instead of just sitting in the morning, which obviously sped proceedings up quite a bit. It was made illegal for judges to sell court offices, and it allowed appeals to be made to common law judges instead of just Chancery Commissioners. We can judge, pun not intended, the extent of these reforms by just how irritated they made Conservative lawyers when they came into effect in 1655. In addition to reforms, the Protector also prioritised reformation. Again, with the aid of Shepherd, a commission for the approbation of ministers, better known as the Triers, was set up in March. This national body was to judge newly trained ministers and ensure that they were qualified and morally upright. This body could have easily fallen into a trap of enforcing religious conformity, but toleration was preserved. The commission was made up of a variety of Protestant creeds, including Presbyterians, Baptists, and General Independents. No one sect would carry the keys to the Commonwealth's churches. The second half of religious reform came in August, with the establishing of ejectors, local commissioners set to investigate established ministers to ensure their quality, and eject them if they failed. The question of what to do about tithes remained hanging. Cromwell and those around him, like Shepherd, wanted to get rid of them and find another way to maintain ministers, but they struggled to find one. Next time, we'll see how Cromwell tries to bring peace to his new realm. The war with the Dutch, which he never really supported, was petering out and needed to be tied up, and a rebellion in Scotland, and the final integration of Scotland into the Commonwealth, had to be dealt with. The Lord Protector hoped to have this all sorted out before the first Protectorate Parliament met, and he'd be successful. Cromwell also hoped that the Parliament would ratify and build on the ordinances and reforms which his new government had instrumented. As we'll see, he would be deeply disappointed. Thank you to my House of Lords, in particular the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, the Duke of Pembroke, Amir Latifi, the Marquis of Ludlow, Nick Robinson, and the Earl of Hillary, John Watson. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. Thank you to everyone who has left a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or told a friend about the show, because that is the best way to help the show grow. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. And thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.